Before we begin this episode, we would like to say that in spirit of reconciliation that we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today.
Thanks for joining us for another episode. You're here with Claire Kenyon, the Red-Lipped Astro.
And Mark Ascara, the Drunk Astronomer.
So to kick us off, planet report, Mark. What's out and about? I know it's pretty boring. It's just Jupiter and Saturn and Venus, yeah?
I feel like they've been out forever, but I won't complain because I've been doing a lot of imaging of Jupiter and Saturn, which we'll talk about later on in Astrophonetography.
Oh, I'm so excited. So Astrophonetography is going to be our in-depth for today. Saturn and Jupiter both have their own conjunctions, so they share their right ascension with the moon on the 11th and the 12th respectively. So the moon will pass about 4 degrees to the south of Saturn, give or take 6 seconds, and 4 degrees to the south, give or take 21 seconds, actually give to the south of Jupiter. Both of those, you'll see them northwest horizon after sunset, and they're setting around 2 and 2:30. So November also brings a full moon with it on the 19th. And do you know what else happens on the 19th, Mark?
I believe there's an eclipse, a lunar eclipse.
Absolutely, a partial lunar eclipse. You could actually almost say full lunar eclipse because it's 97%.
Yes, it's not going to be easy to see from Melbourne, no. That's
absolutely not.
It's
better if you're at higher latitudes. It's going to actually be kind of going through its partial lunar eclipse while it rises from the horizon. So it's only going to get to 16 degrees above the horizon by the time the eclipse ends from Melbourne. So it's probably not the most amazing thing to see from Melbourne, but certainly worth it if you have a really good view to the horizon.
Yeah, so its maximum hits at 8:02 p.m. and the moon isn't even up. Doesn't start rising until about 8:09. So I suppose the best thing to do would get yourself as high as you can to have as many buildings and mountains out of the way as possible so that you can see it as soon as possible. And with everybody running free and wild, people could probably get up to sky high.
Oh gosh, what are we advocating?
Top of the Dandenongs.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
You can sit on top of the Dandenongs. You might see a bit of this. I mean, it's a 97% partial lunar eclipse. If you can see a little bit of it, it's still better than none. So if you can get to the top of the Dandenongs, why not? So what about our moon feature of the month while we're on the moon?
Ooh.
The Montes Apenninus. You chose this one. Why did you choose this one?
Channeling my Italian heritage. Lovely chain of mountains.
Actually, the Apenninus, I think, is Latin, but it does definitely come from the...
It's named after the Italian mountains, though.
They're the Apennines, aren't they?
Yeah, the Apennine Mountains.
Yeah, beautiful.
So I like it because it's just a really cool mountain range, sitting on the moon, separating two, as I would call them, mares, and it's just easy to see. It's pretty big. It's 600 kilometres long, and you can see it in a 4-inch telescope. So you don't need a great deal of, I guess, magnification to see it. They're pretty big. People say that Mons Huygens.
In actual fact, it seems that the correct Dutch pronunciation of this is...
Huygens.
So Mons Huygens is the tallest mountain on the moon, but it's not the highest point on the moon. The highest point on the moon is not a mountain. Did you know that?
What is it?
It doesn't really have a name. That's the Selenian summit. So it's kind of like just in an area on the moon that doesn't really have any real definition.
Yeah, so it's not tall because it's a mountain and pointy.
No.
It's just where the crust is actually sort of sticking out generally, regionally. Yeah.
Yep. And do you know how high Mount Everest is?
No, I've never needed that information.
8,848 metres. That comes courtesy of the Useless Facts Man.
It's a bit of a walk.
It is. Well, the Selenian summit is even higher than that at a lazy 10,786 metres.
Wow. I mean, if there was any oxygen on the moon in the atmosphere, which there isn't, there'd be none up there, right?
No.
So you mentioned Mons Huygens.
Yes.
And there's actually Mons Wolf.
Yep.
Mons Ampere, Huygens, as you said, and Bradley, and in fact Hadley as well. So
Hadley and Hadley Delta and Soraya.
Yeah. So what are they named after? Do you know?
Something to do with Apollo.
Actually, no.
No. Oh, hang on.
So Milo Wolf, or Wolf, probably as they would say it, was a German physicist. He actually came up with the wave structure of matter. André Marie Ampere, of course, was the French mathematician and physicist. Christian Huygens was a Dutch astronomer, mathematician, and physician. Fancy that. Fancy just being an astronomer, mathematician, and physician. Like, look at the stars and then, look at this leech.
Yep.
And James Bradley was an English astronomer.
Here's some salt in the lighter, will you?
And Hadley was an English mathematician.
Yes,
so
he was.
Kind of in my wheelhouse, seeing all these wonderful, albeit male, scientists recognised as mountains.
My confusion comes because Mons Hadley Delta and Mons Hadley it forms the valley where Apollo 15 landed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it actually makes sense that these mountains actually have some connection to science, because that particular mission was one of the most successful scientific missions. So the geological structures around there were actually really interesting, and they explored them a lot with their rover, and it was actually just a really scientifically successful mission. So it kind of ties in nicely, doesn't it?
Yes, and they explored the small peaks of Mons Hadley Delta and the Rim Hadley Ryle as well.
God, that would be amazing.
Apparently, it is the most geologically diverse landing site of all of the places they landed.
Yeah. Just think the moon just all the same, don't you? You think it's like dark and white bits, but actually, it's got its own minerals and its own formations and bits and pieces and geological differences from region to region and little location to location. So how do we find this Montes Apenninus?
I got in trouble the other day because I posted photos of Jupiter upside down. And I always post photos of the moon upside down.
Then maybe in your Instagram account you should be writing in your little
The
profile.
upside down astronomer?
Exactly.
There we go. There's another new name for me.
Every episode you get a new one, don't you? The upside down astronomer.
So it would be, I'm saying it'll be in the southern part of the moon, not the northern part, because we're not in the northern hemisphere. That'd be right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to flip and rotate the moon in my mind.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? Because all we ever see is stuff that from the Northern Hemisphere perspective.
Bloody Americans, I tell you what.
I know. Well, 90% of the population does live that side, so it kind of makes sense.
True.
So I like to use other things that we can navigate by. I also love the way the craters are named after scientists and philosophers as well. So, the crater Copernicus is that sort of white one with the beautiful white ejector rays.
Yes. I love
Exactly.
Copernicus.
It's sort of central-ish. And then it sweeps from there.
Across.
Yeah, exactly. Across and down sort of to Eratosthenes. So there's another crater there. So if you can find those two craters, you'll find that mountain range that kind of sweeps in this beautiful arc. And it's funny because the arc is actually a similar shape, because you said the Apennines in Italy. And it's really interesting because they're the ones that kind of go down the leg of the boot in sort of like 3 arc waves. So it's really nice to sort of see that mirrored in that map on the moon.
Follows the same shape.
Yeah, absolutely. So what created the Montes Apenninus?
Oh, I have no idea, but I do know that they're 3.2 billion years old, roughly.
Yeah, I've seen 3.9, 3.2, 3.9. Doesn't really matter. It's actually relatively young compared to the formation of the moon. What they actually think happened, and you mentioned part of it before, was Mare Imbrium, which is the largest and most prominent of the normal lunar Maria, or Maria. I don't know how to say it, how you would say it.
Ave Maria. Break out in song now.
I'll sing every episode now. The impact that made Mare Imbrium is actually the same impact that made the Montes Apenninus, the ridge.
Well, there you go. Now I can win trivia when someone asks that question.
You can. So, last month we talked about the southern Taurids as a meteor shower that, you should go out and have a look at if you can find them. This month we actually have a couple of meteor showers. So we've got the northern Taurids, which are active from the 20th of October until about the 10th of December, so quite a long time to go out and see them. They peak about the 12th of November. I'm basically just mentioning them because we mentioned the southern Taurids last time. The northern Taurids are found more north in the constellation Taurids, and they're actually not related to the southern Taurids at all. We talked about last month, the southern Taurids have their origin in comet Encke. The northern Taurids actually have their origin in an asteroid by the excellent name of 2004 TG10.
What a cracking name.
And in fact, I don't think the meteor shower is going to be that exciting either.
Well, no, it won't, because you're only going to get 2 meteors per hour at its peak if you're lucky in Melbourne.
Exactly.
Exciting stuff. Don't take your scour into the shower for that one.
So you can go out at 9 p.m. The best views are at 2 a.m.
Yeah.
And to add insult to injury, you might see 2 an hour.
And to add even more insult to injury, skies seem to only be clear when there's a full moon at the moment.
Yeah, that's not what we need.
No, not at all.
No. So we've also got the Leonids. Guess which constellation the Leonids radiate out of, Mark?
No, no idea.
No idea?
No.
Not Leo?
Leo.
So the Leonids are around from the 6th to the 30th of November, so a fairly long time to have a look at those two. They peak on the 17th. They'll be very low on the horizon. So if you actually live in a higher latitude on Earth, you'll probably see them a little bit better.
But again, there's a big, bright bugger of a waxing gibbous moon that's going to be in the way.
100%. So, just kind of have to pretend it's not there, I guess, or look beyond it. So, yeah, they're in the constellation Leo. Because they're so low on the horizon, you're looking at probably a maximum of about 5 an hour. So better than the Northern Taurids, but still not amazing. It's basically for the early morning people. It won't be visible until just before 3 a.m, where it rises above the horizon, with best viewing just before dawn.
That's not early morning people. That's late night people.
Well, who needs sleep anyway?
No.
Right?
Well, see, when we go up to the astronomy site, I sit out on the field with my fellow astronomer, Paul. And everyone's gone to bed, everyone's packed up, and we'll sit there.
Shout out to Paul.
Sometimes I've packed up as well, and he sits out there with one of the other blokes. At 2 or 3 or 4 a.m, you just sit there and just watch beautiful dark skies and you just watch them shoot overhead.
Stunning.
Did you know, though, that back in 1966, what the average rate of meteors per minute was for the Leonids?
No. Has it changed?
As high as 1,000 meteors a minute during a 15-minute span.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yep.
Wow. Do you know why it's changed?
No, but there's never been a year like it. And on average, they say you get about 15 meteors per hour on a good typical year.
Yeah, that's right. So the zenith hourly rate, which is basically if you have a perfectly dark sky and the radiant, which is the point all the meteors look like they're coming from. You actually shouldn't look at the radiant when you're looking for
No, you look away from the radiant.
You look away from about 30 degrees away. But so the zenith hourly rate, the ZHR, is actually the number of meteors you would see on a perfectly dark night if the radiant was directly overhead. So essentially you have the whole sky to see the meteors. And you're right. So these days it's about 15. But from Melbourne with where it is on the horizon, it's about 5. So it's kind of interesting how that cuts that. But I'm fascinated. It kind of gives you this sense of the way that the Earth's orbit around the sun is not a static thing. So a comet or an asteroid or anything can leave a trail of debris, and the Earth moving into it in its normal orbit, you'd think it would be the same all the time, but actually over the years that sort of changes. The actual path of the Earth through space changes, even though it's still going around the sun. It's a reminder that nothing's really static. Everything kind of changes.
No, everything changes, yeah. And we're talking about that with Mary, with Halley's Comet. How next time it comes around, it's going to be bigger and brighter than it's ever been before.
So I'm really excited because our constellation of the month, our star cluster, and our nebula of the month are all kind of vaguely related, or can be related, at least through Indigenous culture, and certainly from what we can see with the naked eye. So tell me about the constellation of the month, Mark, and why did you pick it?
It's Orion, and I picked it because we're talking about astrophonetography this month. And the very first thing I ever imaged with my phone through a telescope was Orion Nebula, which is in the constellation of Orion. So I just sort of thought that would be a nice thing to focus on this month if we're talking about astrophonetography, because I'll be talking about Orion Nebula a little bit in that.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. So Orion is, of course, the hunter. And actually what's really interesting about Orion is it is, again, one of those extremely old constellations. So not only did the Greeks see a picture in sort of that space where Orion sits, but it's got a deep culture that goes right back with the Egyptians. So to the Egyptians, that sort of constellation of Orion was a tribute to the god of light, Osiris. Other cultures have seen a turtle or an octopus. Some cultures put these stars and others that we would normally associate with other asterisms or constellations into larger figures, like an alligator, like a caiman. And then others saw smaller figures within Orion itself. So it's definitely one of those ones that's been around for a long time and been looked at by many, many, many different civilizations as they rise and fall. So tell me, do you know much about it? What stars are in it?
One of them, they say, is a star. You look at it and everyone thinks it's a star, but it's not. It's Orion Nebula, obviously. But in the constellation, it has Betelgeuse, Rigel, Bellatrix, Mintaka. Now we're going to be so scared every time we say names because we're going to think of like Mary in the back of our heads. Al-Nilam, Al-Natak as well, Safe and Misa.
So the great thing when we're observing this particular constellation that I love about it is that you can actually see the colour differences in these stars. It's kind of like Scorpius, you know, when you've got the really, really red colour of Antares. When you look at Orion, you can see the sort of ruddy Betelgeuse or Betelgeuse and blue Rigel. You know, you can see this. Beetlejuice. Oh no, now I've said it 3 times. 3 times in 3 episodes. I'm done.
It's going to appear and kill us all now.
So, you see these colours of the stars, of these really bright stars, and you really appreciate that the stars do have different colours. And, you might be led to thinking, oh, well, why are all the rest of the faint stars white? It actually doesn't come down to stars at all. It comes down to your eyeball.
Yep.
Your eye is not really capable of discerning colour with such a low flux of light. Your sensors in your eye, your cells in your eye, basically switch to night mode. So, when you fumble around with your kit at night and you don't want to turn the light on and everything looks grey, it's the same thing when you look up into the sky because you haven't got enough actual light information for your eyes to sort of switch on the colour sensors, which is why we kind of see white.
Just brought back nightmares of trying to move children into bed in the dark and not stepping on Lego.
Oh, that's awful. Oh. You see these bright stars with the colours, and for me, that's absolutely beautiful. And it's not surprising that so many cultures over so long have had different stories that link these stars together.
That's true. So those brighter stars we were talking about, they form an almost hourglass-like shape as well. When you see them in a night sky, it's very hard to miss them. Very hard to miss them.
Yeah, it's almost like the Pleiades and the Southern Cross. Those sorts of stalwarts of our sky are things that you can really use to navigate by. Similar to Polaris in the Northern Hemisphere, there's the sort of bright, obvious, sometimes groupings of things. And it's no wonder that we see the same thing that sort of our ancestors did and other ancestors around the world did.
True. What objects other than stars are in there? I mean, obviously there's Orion Nebula and the trapezium.
Oh, the trapezium with the 4 brightest stars in the middle.
4?
Is that right?
Only 4? Are you sure?
In the trapezium?
Yeah.
Don't you only need 4?
There's more than 4.
I thought 4 made up the trapezium, but there are plenty in
4 makes up it, but there is more than 4 in there.
Well, that doesn't surprise me. There's a lot of stars there.
And once again, I hark back to the luxuries of being able to look through a 40-inch telescope through the ASV's equipment. And on a really, really good night, you can see upwards of 7 in there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
It's pretty impressive. You can actually see colour as well in the nebula. So you can see pink and green in Orion with your eyes on a really good night. It's unbelievable.
So that's the nebula
That's the
you're
nebula.
referring to. I guess our Greek mythology is one of the things that we know the best. There are 2 stories in Greek or Roman mythology traditions that concern Orion. Well, both stories, in fact, talk about Orion being a great hunter.
Yep.
And, of course, is sort of the picture of the hunter with his bow and arrow in the sky and those 3 bright stars that we sort of know. I think we make them the saucepan in Australia, which is kind of funny.
The pot.
Yeah, the pot. So the 3 stars are the belt of Orion. So there's 2 stories with Orion. They both concern jealousy and Apollo. Basically, one of them was Orion was a really great hunter, and the goddess of the moon and hunting, Artemis, in the Greek stories, and Diana in the Roman tradition, fell in love with Orion, and she was so enamored,
Besotted
so
by
in love with
him.
Orion. Yeah, besotted. She kind of just forgot to take her moon chariot across the sky to light it up at night. She was just so busy just fawning all over Orion. She spent all her time hunting with Orion. Isn't that nice? Oh, yes. Apollo, of course, the sun god who's responsible for lighting up the ground in the daytime, was like, what the hell is this? You can't do that. So when Orion was swimming, Apollo shone his golden rays brightly, so Orion, of course, didn't know where he was going and started swimming further and further away from shore. And Apollo was like, hey, Diana, I bet you can't hit that speck over there. And Diana's like, yeah, I bet I can.
Well,
Just
fully
watch
sick,
this.
man. I can hit that, bro.
She's like pulled back her bow and Diana's just gone flew and hit that speck on the horizon clean.
So it's kind of like Romeo and Juliet.
Essentially, except Apollo's a prick.
Yeah.
And so Diana obviously killed Orion and only found out later when his body washed up on shore because, it's not dramatic enough. And she took his body into the dark part of the sky so that he could light it up and that she could, spend time with him still. I think we call that these days a necrophilia, but, we'll just go with a nice star story.
Yeah, I was going to go with that would make a really good Hollywood movie, but necrophilia works as well.
The other story, of course, is concerning Scorpius, the scorpion, which, of course, we found out from Mary that, used to have really big claws and now it doesn't. So it's actually not the same as what it would have been when the Greeks talked about it. But Orion was a great hunter, except this time he was really prideful and really arrogant. And essentially Gaia, the earth goddess, was just like, no, we don't like that. Stop killing everything. She sent a scorpion that Orion couldn't kill, and the scorpion tried to sting him to death when Orion tried to run away because, it's okay to stab someone in the back when they're running away. So that's fine. But Gaia just basically chucked Scorpius, who'd done nothing wrong. You know, Scorpius has gone and done what he was told to do as a scorpion and sting Orion.
Fall Guy.
So she's chucked Scorpius up in one side of the sky and Orion on the other.
Dodgy, dodgy, dodgy. So did you know, when you look at it from a point of view of medieval Muslim astronomy, Orion was known as Al-Jabbar, the giant?
Oh, because Mary talked about the foot of the giant, didn't she?
Yeah, the foot of the giant, she did, yes. And sixth brightest star, which is safe. I think I've said that right. I hope I'm safe in the way I said safe. Is named for the Arabic Saif al-Jabbar, meaning the sword of the giant.
Wow. Oh, I suppose Saif kind of sounds a bit like saber or something, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. We've been talking about mythology and culture from an Indigenous point of view. Do you have any?
There are so many.
There's a lot.
What's really interesting about Orion and the Pleiades particularly is that all across Australia, despite the diversity and the sheer number of different separate groups of people, a lot of them saw almost the same thing or very connected things. For me, I find that really fascinating how it's just permeated many, many, many cultures, and Indigenous Australians have lots of stories about Orion, and it really just depends on which group you're talking about. I do know that the Yolngu people of Northern Australia saw the three stars are three young men who went fishing in a canoe, and they caught a forbidden kingfish. Sounds delicious, a sawfish. And that's represented by the Orion Nebula, which we'll talk about soon.
The bright stars of Betelgeuse well, for us, the bottom, and Rigel, the top. Yes, that's right.
Upside down.
They formed the bow and the stern of the canoe.
Oh, wow.
The canoe shapes around the three boys, and then the fish off the side.
So to the Torres Strait Islanders, there's this story of a fisherman named Tagai. One day he heads out with about 12 zugabals, which are powerful spirits who influence the seasons and the wind and the water and all that sort of stuff. And they weren't having a great deal of success catching fish. Tagai left the crew and then went off to look in a nearby reef. He was like, oh, fishy, fishy, in the nearby reef. And the day got really, really hot and the crew was super thirsty. There was nothing to drink except for the water that belonged to Tagai. When Tagai came back, he discovered that they had drunk all his water, and so he killed them and he sent them up into the sky, and he put them up into two groups. 6 of the men were placed in Usual, which is the Pleiades, and the other 6 in Utimal, which is Orion, and then said, hey, you guys, stay the hell away from me. They actually still use this constellation for navigation today. What's really cool about the Tagai constellation, depicted as a man standing in a canoe, for once, unlike Parvo, here is a constellation that actually looks like what it's supposed to. It looks like a man with a spear in a boat.
It does. It absolutely does. I've done a bit of research on the Kolkan Bulla, so the Buron people from the Mallee, and they talk about Orion as Kolkan Bulla, which is 2 young dancing men. And Kolkan Bulla is the stars we know as the belt and the sword of Orion. So they're dancing at a corroboree. And the star cluster Pleiades, they see as Lannenkirk, group of stars that we know as Pleiades, which is a group of young women watching the young men dance. And then you have Aldebaran, or as I like to call it, Alderon, which is Galalek, say it right, which is an old man singing and beating to the time of the dancing. And he's also known as the Major Mitchell Cockatoo, which I think is like really cool.
So, fun fact, Mark.
Fun fact.
Let's just assume that you have stellariums. You can go and download Stellarium. It's absolutely fantastic. It's a planetarium on your hard drive. It's absolutely brilliant. And you can turn on the constellations to find what we're talking about. You can find a date. You can find a location on Earth. And you can, we can't find a date. I think there are other apps for that. But you can put a date in and put a time in and work out what you can see in the sky. But anyway, if you turn on the pictures of the constellations in Stellarium, the Orion Nebula is bang in the crotch of the picture. So when you zoom in on the picture of Orion, the constellation picture, right where his skirt is, his crotch is there. That's the Orion Nebula right there. I feel so sacrilegious or something right now. I don't know who I'm offending, but I know I'm offending
Forgive
somebody.
Me, Father, for I have sinned.
I don't know if that was an accidentally on purpose thing, but it sure is amusing. Right, so now that I've given you that delicious / not so delicious tidbit / not tidbit about the location of the Orion Nebula within Orion's crutch, Orion's Nebula. Well, it's 1,500 light years away and about 24 light years or so across. Is that why you picked it?
I picked it for a couple of reasons. It's amazing to look at. You can see it even in light polluted Melbourne. Where I am, 10k out from Melbourne, I can see Orion Nebula. Even when the moon is up, could make out just rising Orion Constellation, and I can see just the 3 stars. So on a non-moon night, you will see Orion Nebula. It'll look like a star. And then if you get a pair of binoculars and you look at it, it'll look like a fuzzy blob. It'll look like someone smudged the star across your binoculars in the city. The main reason I chose it, because once again, astrophonetography, it was the first object I imaged, and from my very first image to what I'm producing now, the differences are astounding, and the differences from just learning and growing and using the equipment and understanding stacking and processing. And it's from my backyard in suburban Melbourne, and you're able to do astrophotography with this object from a suburban Melbourne backyard with your phone. So it's a very good object to learn to do things from an astronomical point of view. It is just a really good beginner's target and expert target.
So the Orion Nebula, of course, is a particular type of nebula?
It's a diffuse nebula.
Yeah. And do you know why it's colourful? This one is actually glowing.
Mm-hmm.
This is an emission nebula, which means that the gas itself is emitting light. Why does the gas emit the light? Well, there are all these bright blue stars, these really hot and bright stars right around the nebulae, and this light hits this gas. It excites electrons in the gas, which kind of, get up off the couch and they jump around. They lose their energy in the form of light and get back on the couch. That's how I always talk about it. So the couch is kind of the rest position. Everyone likes lying on the couch. That's the rest position for electron. They're like, yeah, just chilling out with my proton. I'm fine. They get hit with a bunch of light from a star. They're like, oh, crap, got to get up and about, got to move. I've got way too much energy. So they jump around and they go up several levels. It's like jumping from the couch to the roof, and having a really good time on the roof. But eventually everybody likes the couch.
Sounds like me.
Oh, absolutely. This is definitely geared towards you.
Yeah.
Eventually you want to sit back on the couch though, right? Like that's the home position. That's the comfy spot. So when the electron wants to get back on the couch, it's got to give off that extra energy, right? So it shoots out that energy in light before it gets back on the couch. So what you're seeing in emission nebulae, typically it's hydrogen. This electron's got excited to another level because of all the light from the stars around. And then it's like, nah, look, I really don't like staying up here. It's a little bit uncomfortable. And it gets back on the couch, which is its normal ground resting state, and it gives off that extra light it had. And that's why we actually see the gas glowing. So this nebula actually would take up the mass of 2,000 suns inside. That's what we're talking about. So quite massive, and it's a beautiful nest of creation. So there's probably some stars in there that we can't even see because they're shrouded in dust. There's certainly some stars that we've seen that have what we call proplids or protoplanetary disks, which is exactly what it sounds like. Disks around young stars that actually someday may condense and form planets.
Isn't that exciting?
Isn't it? And there's also a population of very small brown dwarfs as well, which aren't normal stars. They typically have between 15 and 75 times the mass of Jupiter, so not quite our sun. They don't have enough mass to do normal fusion, which is, hydrogen into helium. They do have enough mass to sometimes put deuterium together and sometimes to fuse lithium together, but they're not normal stars. They're kind of weak and they're failed stars. But it's interesting that the Orion Nebulae is this home of star birth, because if you look back in ancient mythology, right back to the Maya of Mesoamerica, they actually called these 3 bright stars in the belt the hearthstones, and they saw it as the cosmic fire of creation. So it's amazing that it has this astrophysical creation of stars, stellar nursery connotations, but also has this incredible Mayan interpretation of pretty much the same thing. That's where life came from.
Did you know Sidereel Trading have a strong emphasis on quality products and service-oriented sales and technical staff? But wait, there's more. Sidereel Trading's key strength is their ability to work closely with customers to achieve the results they desire. So whether your interests lie in nightscape photography, panoramas, wide-field Milky Way or deep sky nebula and galaxies, Sidereel Trading can supply the astrophotography equipment you need and a free set of steak knives. Visit www.sidereeltrading.com.au. Steak knives not included.
Okay, Mark, so challenge target
yes
for November.
Yes,
got
and you
2.
picked some bloody tough ones, didn't you?
Well, one of them's really hard. That's an asteroid. And, well, it's actually not even an asteroid.
It's a dwarf planet.
Yeah, it's a dwarf planet. So we may as well talk about that.
Yeah.
Ceres 1, designated Ceres 1 because it was the first dwarf planet found.
Do you know who it was discovered by?
Go for it.
Oh, just my Italian heritage kicking in. Giuseppe Piazzi on the 1st of January, 1801.
Right. So you're complaining about not being able to see this dwarf planet and they found it in 1801.
Yeah, I know, but they didn't have light pollution like we've got.
Nah, pull it together.
Hashtag challenge accepted. Going to try and find it through the 40-inch up at the LNDSS. I will report back and if we found it.
I hope so.
Although it takes multiple nights to find Pluto and confirm you found it. I reckon I'd need a week to confirm I found Ceres 1.
This is smaller than Pluto, definitely. It sits between Mars and Jupiter and it has about 25% of the mass of the asteroid belt. It certainly isn't anywhere near the size of Pluto. So if it's taking you that many nights, Mark, maybe you should not quit your day job.
I'd be broke.
The best night for you to go and have a look is on the 27th because it will be at opposition, which means, of course, it's on the opposite side of the Earth to the sun.
Oh, sorry, I'm busy on the 27th.
Oh, but you said you needed many nights, so you'll be fine.
Honestly, shout out to my sister Gabby. I know how hard it has been to try and organise a wedding in multiple lockdowns through COVID. And I'm sorry, Ceres, as interesting as you are, if I don't turn up to my sister's wedding, I may as well be disowned from the family. So I will be at a wedding.
Okay, well, I'll allow you to look at Ceres either on the 26th or the 28th. It'll be close enough. And if you were going to look at it, Mark, you would invoke your best Richie Benno.
2 for 22.
And you are going to look on the 27th, or the 26th or the 28th, whatever. But on the 27th, you're going to go outside from Melbourne. You're going to look above the northeastern horizon at 2222. And guess what? It's going to be 22 degrees above the northeastern horizon at 2222.
And that's 2 22s. It's 3 22s. It's 2 22s at 22 degrees.
And you're going to watch that because you've got nothing else to do until 1:15 a.m. where it gets to about 35 degrees above the northern horizon. And it's going to sink in the northwest after 4 a.m. Ceres, of course, is the only dwarf planet located in the inner solar system. It's not really that surprising that he found the biggest bloody thing in the inner solar system that wasn't a planet. Well done, Giuseppe. Ceres, of course, is the name of the Roman goddess of summer.
And it's coming into summer now.
The blooming earth, agriculture, harvests, grain, corn, like cereals. Guess where the name Ceres came from?
I will never forget that.
As we said before, it's not actually okay to call Ceres an asteroid. They went through a deed poll arrangement where they changed their name from asteroid to
they went to birth, deaths and
planet.
marriages, did they?
Absolutely. And the judge hit the gavel and said, you know what? I dub you now Ceres 1 dwarf
I now
planet.
pronounce you dwarf planet.
It's also quite a lot bigger and quite different compositionally than the other asteroids in the belt. So it's been reclassified as a dwarf planet since 2006. One of the interesting things about Ceres, it's the only dwarf planet in the inner solar system. And we know it has water.
Ooh.
So we want to know, does it have other stuff that goes with water? Does it have life? It's orbiting about 2.8 times the orbit of Earth, so 2.8 AU. It takes about 4.6 Earth years to go around the sun. And it doesn't actually have any seasons because it's only tilted at about 4 degrees. So Earth is tilted at 23.5. Ceres is pretty much not doing anything. It's got no seasons, no variation. So, you know, when you couple that with the whole idea of water, it kind of becomes a bit interesting. So at some stage, watch this space. Ceres, we're coming for you.
So what you're saying is Crowded House can't perform there 4 seasons in one day.
The really awesome thing about Ceres, just while you're looking at it, I want you to know something. On the 27th, you're going to go out and you look at it, right?
Yes. No, not the 27th.
Everyone other than the drunk astronomer is going to go outside, look for Ceres 1 on the 27th, right? At 2222, they're going to look 22 degrees above the northeastern horizon. And I want you to appreciate that it takes 22 minutes for the light from Ceres to travel through the scope down to your eyeball.
It is officially known as Richie Benno from now on. It is no longer Ceres.
Dwarf Planet RB.
Dwarf Planet RB, Richie Benno.
So the other challenge target we've got for you this month, It's actually a periodic comet, and it's usually
Found in the periodical section?
It's found in the periodic table under comets. Reaches its perigee on the 13th. And perigee, of course, means near to
Near to, yes.
Earth.
I'm slowly learning this stuff.
So it'll be the brightest about the 7th, but closest to Earth about the 13th.
Is it a Jupiter family comet?
You're absolutely right. It is a Jupiter family comet.
From the Kuiper Belt?
From the Kuiper Belt, yeah. So the Kuiper Belt is basically from the orbit of Neptune, which is about 30 times the distance of Earth to the Sun, so 30 AU, all the way out to 50 AU.
It's a long way when you think about it.
Jupiter's massive, right? And has a lot of gravity. And so sometimes with all this stuff that's going around the sun at 30 AU, you know, it might actually encourage something to kind of come in. And so you get this group of comets that are called periodic Jupiter family comets, and they go around the sun and they sort of orbit near Jupiter, and they're typically captured from this Kuiper Belt. This comet is called 67P, P for periodic. 67 because there's a 67th one discovered. Churyumov-Gerasimenko. And it's actually quite famous. It's not like Halley's Comet famous because it's really bright and comes around every 76 odd years. It's not famous because it's Hale-Bopp and a whole bunch of people decided that it meant something to them, but only briefly. It's actually famous because there was a Rosetta spacecraft. You know, Rosetta is, of course, all about...
The Rosetta Stone?
Yeah, deciphering language, right? So it was about being able to decipher Egyptian languages. The Rosetta mission was named after Rosetta Stone, of course. And then it had this little lander called Philae, which is named after an obelisk, which is one of those tall, kind of pointy Egyptian structures. The Philae obelisk is actually the one that bears the bilingual inscription, and it was used along with the Rosetta Stone to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs for the first time. So that's all kind of like this Egyptian understanding language, understanding the universe, our history sort of idea to this. And Rosetta went out to a comet, which was 67P, Churyumov-Gerasimenko, and it orbited this comet 13 kilometers away, so not that far. Philae went and landed, or tried to land on this comet. It didn't do so well. It tried hard, and then it was the first successful soft landing, which is essentially a nice way of saying crashing but not failing onto the comet. And there's this absolutely incredible video of stacked images. It almost looks like it's snowing, so it's got this sort of look like it's on a cliff.
Flaky looking, isn't it?
Have you seen it? Oh, it was amazing.
Yeah.
It's an astronomy picture of the day from the 15th of March 2020. Go and have a look. It's an image from the Rosetta spacecraft, and it's recorded these dust and ice just falling down, and it's near this cliff, and you would honestly think you were in Yosemite or near another cliff on Earth, like a really sheer cliff face, and it just looks like snow, and it's really just this comet sort of disintegrating the dust and the ice as it goes around the sun, and I find it absolutely amazing. And
eventually it will disappear, won't it? Eventually there's going to end up nothing left of that.
Well, pretty much comets always will. Essentially what happens when they come around the sun, the ice melts and the dust breaks apart. Depending on how solid the head of the comet is, you've got all sorts of gravitational effects, whether it gets kicked out. So the fact that it goes near Jupiter all the time is a bit of a thing. Actually, in the mid-1800s, the closest that this comet ever got to the sun was about 4 times the orbit of Earth, so 4 AU.
So it never really got very close.
No, and now the closest distance to the Earth it gets is 0.42, and then the closest it gets to the sun is 1.2, so that's quite a big difference. And
that's 4 times closer.
Right, it gives you a little bit of an appreciation for the way that the gravity of Jupiter can really just kick something in towards the sun or in towards the Earth. And so suddenly it's just got this new orbit, you know, it's just drifted closer to the sun over the century, and then it gave it another gravitational kick because it wasn't done kicking it while it was down in 1959, and basically, now it's at about 1.2, 1.3 AU. So it's about 27 million miles, 43 million kilometers outside Earth still, but we don't have to worry about it crashing.
Not going to come near us.
Oh no, but it's kind of interesting that something that was so far away and so boring is now kind of interesting. It comes around every, how many years?
6.5 years.
Yeah, so it orbits the sun about once every 6.5 years. You're amazing, the drunk astronomer. You're amazing.
I know. It's amazing how good I am at just knowing stuff off the top of my head thanks to like Google.
One last thing to say about this. In the spirit of crashing stuff into stuff when we're done with it.
Did we crash something into it again?
Yeah.
Oh, how good are we at crashing stuff?
We crashed Rosetta, this beautiful little spacecraft we sent to have a look at it and to orbit and check out whether Philae could land. We got bored of that. You know, it kind of hung out with the comet for a long time. They were like, no, we've had enough. time to end mission. And Rosetta's like, no, I'm happy to just keep orbiting. And they're like, no, your end of mission
Now
is
we're done
here.
with that. A new shiny
We're
thing.
done with you. And Rosetta's like, no, I just want to keep going.
How much more shiny stuff can we make before we move on?
They crashed the Rosetta spacecraft into an area in the comet called Ma'at. Ma'at is the ancient Egyptian goddess of truth, justice, harmony, and balance, apparently. And that's a region on the comet. So they just went, you know what, Rosetta, see you later. We're done with you. Bye.
Yeah, that'll do. We'll put you in there.
So, just quickly, there's no surprise with our photo challenge of the month, Mark. It is a dusty reflection nebula in, drumroll, Orion.
It is. It is indeed. It is NGC1788 and it's part of the in-depth astrophonetography.
We'll tell you exactly how you have to image this because there are some restrictions, right? We want you to actually image this in the spirit of astrophonetography.
You're going to need a dark sky. It's just a matter of getting there and setting up and giving it a go. So we want to try and see phone images of this. And it's going to be interesting to see how this one comes out, whether anyone can actually do it, because I don't think I've ever seen an astrophonetography image of NGC1788. I know I've never taken one. I now have the summer months to give it a shot at the dark sky site, and I am going to give NGC1788 a crack. But it's a reflection nebula in the constellation of Orion. It's flanked by a dark nebula known as LIN 1616, which is part of NGC1788.
Some people think that this nebula, NGC1788, actually looks like a bat.
Batman!
But yeah, it's basically shaped by all of these new stars that are hidden within the nebula amongst all the dust. But one of the great things about NGC1788, and one of the reasons it's given so much light to reflect, is that the stars inside this nebulae, which are causing all of the light to be reflected, are only about 1 million years old, which is actually not that much. Like,
oh, wow, that's really young, isn't it?
that's super young.
Yeah.
Very, very, very young compared to most stars. So you're sort of looking at relatively recent history, which I think is kind of cool. So tell me about our in-depth topic, astrophonetography.
Well, I get referred to often by those who I work closely with on all of the live streams of the ASV as the cheapskate astronomer. So I'm not the drunk astronomer, I'm the cheapskate astronomer, because I'm not a big fan of spending big bucks where I don't think you need to. And if you've got a decent camera that can take raw data images, and unfortunately the old iPhones can't, the new ones
I
can.
was about to say, most of them do, don't they? Like, I know most Androids do.
Most Androids do. So the old iPhone, I had an iPhone 6 and it didn't.
Androids for the win.
And yeah, I had an iPhone 6. It didn't take raw data and it was just a pain in the ass to try and do. So when it was time for a new phone, I went, okay, for the first time in a very, very long time since iPhones came out, I'm going to an Android. And I went for a Huawei P30 Lite for a couple of reasons. It was cost effective. It was about $350 to buy. So it's not expensive. It's essentially a camera that makes phone calls. It has a camera bias setup of red, yellow, blue, RYYB, which is not fairly typical when it comes to cameras with phones. And also, it doesn't take raw data. Being an Android, it has access to apps that do allow you to use it to take raw data and treat it as a DSLR. So I use a program called Deep Sky Camera app, which is in beta format at the moment. So it's in testing. I'm one of the testers for it for the guy, I believe he's in Germany, who's been working on this app. So I take data and test it and send it back to him and let him know how I've gone. He's made adjustments to suit what I've complained about, I guess. And I can take 30-second images, ISO 1600 as a max on it at the moment. So the telescope was secondhand. It cost about $1,000, maybe a bit more, $1,200.
For an 8-inch mead.
For an 8-inch mead,
$1,000.
secondhand. I may have had to drive to Canberra and back in a day and stop at multiple breweries along the way.
Oh, I had to stop at those breweries.
Sacrifices were made. Trips to Tidbinbilla were made in one day to collect your telescope, the things you've got to do. And then the eyepiece, the one I usually use for deep sky is a 24mm Telview Panoptic. I think they retail for $300 plus in dollar format. So there's $1,500 worth of equipment. And the phone is the phone. Whether you're using it for imaging or whether you're using it for phone calls, I don't actually include that in the cost of my equipment.
It's there anyway, right?
So I'm at $1,500 roughly plus $13 or $12 for the phone holder. And that's it. That's what I use. And with that, over the year, well, the last 12 months in particular, I have learnt to change ISO settings. I've learnt about exposure lengths. I have taught myself a lot and been taught a lot on stacking and processing. A phone camera is not a digital camera, and it is not a proper, true astrophotography camera. So what people will do ISO-wise with a digital SLR and exposure-wise, you can't really do that with a phone. You have to change it. You have to adjust it. In light-polluted areas with a digital SLR or with Astro equipment where you've got proper filters, you can deal with light pollution. With a phone, you can't, so you've got to drop your ISO down as short as you can and your exposure length fairly short and just take extra images and stack them. The stacking part is probably the most complex part of all of it. And the hardest part, really, is that, once again, if you have proper equipment, you can adjust focus on your computer as you're going. If you've got a proper astrophotography camera, you can hook it up to your computer and you can do the whole focusing of stars and you can guide and you can track. With a phone, you can't do any of that. You literally have to make sure when you look through the eyepiece that what you're looking at is sharp, that you focused it to the best that your eyes can tell you it is focused. And then you have to put the phone camera with the adapter onto the eyepiece and start taking photos. And you can't change the focus from there, because the moment you start mucking around with that, it's out of focus and you have to go and start all over again. It's very labor intensive. It's very manual, so when astrophotographers will do their imaging, they will spend time setting up, guiding, tracking, polar aligning, and then they'll start and then they'll go off and do what they've got to do. I can't do that. I have to make sure I've got my telescope aligned, set up, tracking, that it's doing what it needs to do, put the attachment with the phone on the eyepiece, and I sit outside with a beer and I sit there with a Bluetooth clicker and I click and I take might be a 15-second exposure or a 30-second exposure, whatever the ISO setting is, and I wait and I sit there in my chair out in the cold watching it, and then it clicks over and it says ready to take another photo, and then I click again. And if I want 100 images, I have to do that 100 times. And then I have to sit and sift through those images to see which ones are actually pretty good, because some of them might be a bit blurry. The telescope might move a little bit with the breeze, and so the stars aren't quite sharp. And it's very labor intensive, which I think actually makes it really exciting and sort of drags you in and you go, oh, wow, what can I do better next time? Because it's not up to the devices that you're using. It's up to you to make sure you're doing it correctly. So I feel like there's a little bit more love involved in it. And you get the best of both worlds. You get to look at the object before you image it, and then you get to image it. Recently, I've started doing planetary, and Claire, you would have seen some of my images I posted. The first ones I posted, which weren't great, they were single images of the planets, and now I'm starting to stack.
Yeah, it's amazing actually, the difference between one image, which is just like a blurry blob, it doesn't matter what you're looking at, and then you start stacking and suddenly you get a planet or a moon or
the crash of Orion,
a nebula.
A nebula.
Just to backtrack slightly, when you talk about stacking,
yes.
So for anybody that's listening that is just kind of generally interested in space, that's never really started any type of photography, there are two types of ways you can get more information, right? So earlier in the podcast we were talking about looking at the stars and our eyes not having enough light information to give us a color. So when we look into a telescope, for example, we have the same problem where we don't have enough information basically in light. So one way you can do that is to look for longer. So you open the eyepiece of the lens for a longer time, so a longer exposure time, which I think you mentioned.
Capture more light.
Exactly. And the other option is to take lots of short pictures and then literally digitally stack them and compress them onto each other. So you seem to have this workflow where you are learning the perfect time to take a photo, to open the lens for long enough, and then to take enough photos to stack them on top of each other to give you enough information to give you a good photo.
Exactly.
It seems to be the core of all astrophotography, and astrophonetography definitely seems to share that aspect.
Oh, it absolutely does. And the hard part is that it's not like using a digital camera, and it's not like using an astrophotography camera. It's very different. And each phone is completely different in how they work as well. So you need to learn your phone. You need to learn what works best for your phone. So you might spend a month imaging Orion on completely different settings every single time, and then trying to work out what's the best. So I know when I go up to the dark sky side, if I'm going to image Orion, if Orion's up, I'm going to go, okay, I only want 10 to 15 second images at the most. And I want the ISO to be down at sort of like 300 600 at the most. Because if it's any higher than that, and if it's any longer than that, you won't see the trapezium. It just gets washed out by the brightness of that nebula. But when I'm at home imaging, I'll do Orion at 600 ISO, and I'll go 15 to 30 seconds, somewhere in that range, because light pollution kicks in.
When you talk about ISO, for anybody that's not a big camera person?
I'm not a big camera person.
So the ISO, as I understand it, is basically how sensitive your camera is to light. So if you turn the ISO up, it's really sensitive. And if you turn it down, it's really not sensitive. It's sort of where you put your max and min. And if your max is right up with the brighter stuff, then it draws your min up with the brighter stuff as well. And if you have your max and min right low, then everything will look dark. And I think everybody's taken a photo like that before. So it's definitely worth understanding what those typical camera terms mean and how to use them.
I can sit outside and I go, okay, I know I need to adjust the ISO setting down or up. And I know I need to extend the exposure length or shorten the exposure length. But for me, it's trial and error. And if you know what they mean, if you know how they work, it's still trial and error with a phone because it's not native. It's so different to what we're used to with a digital camera and so different to what astrophotographers are used to with their camera equipment. Practice makes perfect. When I'm doing something like Jupiter and Saturn, I'm taking 30-second to 1-minute videos. So it's different. So with the deep sky stuff, you're taking images and you're taking multiple images. And I need to learn how to do darks and flats and things like that. But I'm only doing lights at the moment. So we can come back to that in 3 or 6 months' time. And I know how to do darks and flats with my phone. And yes, the phone does allow me the option of doing darks and flats. I just don't know how they work yet or how to do them yet. But when it comes to planetary, it's all about videoing and not taking still images. I put the moon filter on, I drop the brightness down as low as I can, and I'll record 30 seconds to a minute. And I'll do that 10 or 15 times for Jupiter, 10 or 15 times for Saturn. So there's a lot of footage there. And then I'll download that to the computer and then I'll convert it from an MP4 file into an AVI using a program because AutoStack it doesn't recognize MP4. So I have to then convert the file and then you put into AutoStack it and you analyze it and you tell it to stack a percentage of images and then it gets the best 10% or 20% of the images that you've recorded and it stacks them and you move it to Photoshop. But it is a very big learning curve. It's exciting. It's fun. And I challenge anybody to give it a go. If you've got a telescope, whether it tracks or not, even if it's an 8-inch Dobsonian, you can put your eyepiece on it. You can point it to Orion Nebula and you can take 5-second or 2-second images of Orion. And you can take heaps of them and keep moving the telescope, put it back in the center and take more. And you can get a program like Astro Pixel Processor. It will cost you some money, not a lot. It'll cost you about $150 for the year. It'll detect what those stars are. And it'll go, all of these images have those stars in that same pattern. It lines them up for you. And it'll blow your mind what you can do with a phone, even without tracking on a telescope.
I'm so excited for our astrophonetography competition. Hopefully people can submit their best photos of NGC1788 with their astrophonetography setup. Even if it's your first go, give it a go. Did we have a prize this month, Mark?
The prize this month will be an Astro Boy beer glass or wine glass from Boomstick Glassware.
Fantastic. That leads us to our final section of the podcast. Shit.
You
Should.
No.
Because you should.
Absolutely should.
So I'm going to talk to you about something that you might have noticed, and that is something called Twilight. And I'm not talking about a new moon or breaking dawn. Or
No, to be honest,
so I'm not talking about that type of Twilight.
No.
Generally, we would describe twilight as the time after sunset and before sunrise. So it's not the whole darkness time. It's the time when there's still some light from the sun that gets through. And this is because the light from the sun refracts up into our atmosphere and, illuminates the sky a little bit. And we can actually see to varying degrees depending on twilight. So we often use the term dusk for evening, which is post-sunset, and we use the word dawn for the morning. But twilight is that time when the sun is actually not above the horizon, but the light is still visible to us earthlings. There's actually 3 kinds of twilight, Mark. Did you know that?
No. I didn't.
You don't want to guess what they are?
No.
Okay. One of them is called civil twilight.
Well, that's very civil of you.
Ah, isn't it? I'm so gallant. One of them is called nautical twilight, and no guesses where that came from.
From the land.
And one is called astronomical twilight. So we've got civil, nautical, and astronomical twilight. And they all basically relate to how far below the horizon the geometric center, so the dot right in the middle of the circle, if we drew the sun, is from the horizon, so that angle. And one comes after the other, or one precedes the other. For example, after sunset, you get civil twilight, and then you get nautical twilight, and then you get astronomical twilight. And then coming into the dawn, you get astronomical twilight, then you get nautical twilight, and then you get civil twilight.
And there's like 6 degrees between each of them.
Yeah, you're totally ruining the punchline here.
Sorry.
You're right. It's all about the angle of the sun below the horizon. So civil twilight is the period of time when the middle of the sun is 0 degrees from the horizon down to 6 degrees below the horizon. And the moment that it hits 6 degrees below the horizon, we call that civil dusk. And the other side of the day, I suppose, before it rises, when it's exactly 6 degrees just before it rises to the horizon, when it's 6 degrees below, we call that civil dawn. So civil twilight is the type of time when, for example, you've been watching the sunset and you're like, oh, we should go home and watch that last episode of whatever we were binging on the TV. And you've still got plenty of time and plenty of light to pack up the picnic. You can look down and you're like, yeah, I can see everything. Everything's fine. We can walk back to the car.
I've still got time to set up the telescope.
100%, right? You know where your kids are. You can see them. And you put them in the picnic basket. I mean, you put your plates in the picnic basket. You call the kids over. You put them in the car. You put everything in the car and you can see it, right? And you drive home. You can normally see the brightest stars and the brightest planets in civil twilight, but that's about it.
You can see the drunk star as well.
The drunk
Can of
star.
piss. Yeah.
But interestingly enough, civil twilight is still used by governments to define legally when we should be putting on our lights in our cars, for example, or when street lights should be coming on, or when hunting has to stop. So you can see stuff, but probably not well enough to shoot them, apparently. So that's 0 to 6 degrees, okay? And then from 6 degrees to 12 degrees, that's called nautical twilight. Now, using your extensive knowledge of etymology and the use of words through history, what do you think nautical twilight is referring to?
Boats.
Boats. Yes, you're absolutely right. So you've probably heard that sailors navigate by stars, but actually it's a lot easier if they can see the horizon at the same time. So if they can see where the horizon is, where it's kind of like land, sea, or sea sky, it's much easier to get a proper bearing. And nautical twilight is basically that time. It's when you've got clear weather and you can see the horizon and you can see some stars that you can navigate by, such as Polaris, which we talked about last time with Mary Adam. So nautical twilight is that time between 6 and 12 degrees. And when it hits 12 degrees after sunset, it's at nautical dusk. And when it's 12 degrees before it rises, it's at nautical dawn. And it sounds like super archaic, like something old from like Pirates of the Caribbean or that sort of thing,
Jack
you know.
Sparrow.
But actually it's still in use. So in the US military, they still refer to BMNT. Any guesses what that might mean?
No.
How about begin, morning, nautical twilight?
Wow.
And the time EENT.
End.
And evening, nautical twilight. So they still use these times to plan military operations, tactical operations. So, you know, it's kind of useful to know when you're going to be able to see a little bit.
Unbelievable, isn't it?
Now, this is the time that I'm going to call the Lego time, right? Like,
That's not the time you stand on Lego in the dark, is it?
it's not quite the time we stand on Lego in the dark.
I've done it
it's where
before
you
and it
sort of
hurts.
try to step over the piece of Lego that you think you can see and you actually end up standing on the dog poo. It's that time where everything's a bit grey, where you've been watching the sunset and it's just a bit late. You can't quite make out the kids from the bushes and you can't quite make out the champagne glass from the picnic basket. So you really wish that you'd packed up 10 minutes earlier after the sunset. It's this kind of like grey time where you can see enough to get by, but not really enough to pack up the picnic basket. And then following that, we've got something called astronomical twilight. And I'm sure you've got the hang of it here from sixes and angles We've got 0 to 6, 6 to 12.
So 18.
Oh, he's a smart one.
Yeah, boo boo. I'm smarter than the average man.
So astronomical twilight goes between 12 and 18 degrees below the horizon. At 18 degrees below the horizon, after sunset, we call that astronomical dusk. And then when the sun's at 18 degrees before it rises, below the horizon, before it rises, we call that astronomical dawn. So in places where we have light pollution, like cities and suburbs, astronomical twilight is pretty much the same as what we would call darkness, which is kind of scary. So we don't really even notice that difference. For us, it's just the same lit sky that it is throughout the night. But certainly out in less populated areas where there's less light pollution, there is a difference between when the sun is 12 degrees versus when the sun is 18 degrees below the horizon. Even though the sun is 18 degrees below the horizon, the light is still being refracted and reflected through the atmosphere and lighting up the atmosphere a little bit. So the sky is actually glowing still a little bit, which means that we don't see the deepest sky objects like galaxies and nebulae and globular clusters, but we do see bright stuff like planets and really bright stars, and we can see most objects. Now, you mentioned before, Mark, you cottoned on very quickly about it being a game of angles.
It is a game of angles. It's not a Game of Thrones, that's for sure.
So if you think about the angle that the Earth makes to the sun and how the Earth has obviously got a rotational angle of 23.5 degrees. So it goes around the sun in a plane and it rotates on an axis that's 23.5 degrees to that plane. And that's actually what gives us our seasons. And believe it or not, our twilight time changes throughout the year. So there's actually a connection between our length of twilight time and the use of daylight savings. So if you look at Hawaii, for example, it's near the equator. It has a shorter twilight time than somewhere lower or higher than the equator than, say, Melbourne or Alaska. So obviously where you are on Earth matters and your inclination to the sun matters. So twilight definitely depends on latitude.
What about twilight at the poles?
Right. And you might have heard of the land of the midnight sun.
Yes, I have. Yes,
so
absolutely.
This is the idea that at the South and the North Pole, the sun actually never goes below the horizon for that 24 hours, right? In the middle of summer.
Would that
well,
be?
In the middle of winter, I think it would be pretty horrible, but I quite like the summer and the light, so I'd be okay with that during summer. So during the summer, the sun never goes below the horizon for 24 hours, but in the winter, the sun never rises above the horizon for 24 hours, just because of the tilt of the Earth relative to how it goes around the sun. As you get closer to the poles at either end, or alternatively, you might describe that as very high latitudes, the sun never goes beneath 18 degrees below the horizon, right?
Mm-hmm.
So astronomical twilight is the entire night. You know, the sky glows the whole time. So twilight is very, very, very long. It goes from dusk till dawn, essentially.
Good movie,
and
that.
as you go from the poles to the equator, that changes, right? So you start to get a gap between dusk till dawn. You get astronomical nighttime in the middle there. So your astronomical twilight between dusk and astronomical nighttime, which of course is darkness, becomes shorter. And so you get twilight at either side of this darkness. And as you get to the equator, you essentially get almost no twilight. Well, there you go. I've got a fun little challenge for our listeners.
Yeah, throw it at them.
Ooh, so if our listeners are up to this,
I'm going to give it a try as well.
So the challenge that I have for our listeners, Mark, and for you, if you're up for it,
I'm
is
up
to see
for
if you can calculate the various dawns and dusks. So try and work out, just through where you are on Earth, what time your civil, nautical, and astronomical dusk and dawns will be, dependent on your latitude. You might need to employ the assistance of your favorite internet search engine,
Google,
in order to work out your latitude, and potentially use some year 9 or 10 trigonometry. The number of times I've had kids say to me, "Oh, when am I going to use that maths, miss?" The answer is right now in this podcast.
There you go.
If you really feel like some fun, questionable use of the word fun, you might want to compare that to your sunset and sunrise times, and then have a look at that at different times of the year.
We'd like to give a shout out to our very first Patreon supporter, Mr. Steve Paulson. Thank you, Steve, for your support. It means a lot to us as we begin this journey into the world of podcasting. If anyone else out there would like to support Spaghettification, please head to our website at www.spaghettification.com.au and follow the links to our Patreon page. Sidereel Trading can supply the astrophotography equipment you need. Visit www.sidereeltrading.com.au.
Hey, subscribe, sponsor, or support us. Head along to our website at www.spaghettification.com.au, that's spaghettification.com.au, and follow the links to subscribe. Photo submission for the Astrophotography Photo of the Month is through our website. Check us out on YouTube and Instagram, and keep an eye out for submitted photos which need your vote on our Instagram page. We now have a Patreon, which gives you special access to extra behind-the-scenes content, bloopers, and potentially a guest spot on the podcast. If you'd like your name or business featured in a podcast, hit us up at spaghettificationpodcast@gmail.com.